Well, hi, everyone. I think we're live at the moment. So welcome to our second to last episode on discussion on the book Fethullah Gülen's Teaching and Practice. We're on our second to last chapter on learning and loss, and we're again joined by Professor Paul Weller to discuss the chapter. Paul, just kind of very early on in the chapter, I realized, when I got to the end of the chapter, I realized that very early on in the chapter, there's a lot of definitions and a lot of content from people that have been interviewed on loss. So loss from a lot of different perspectives, whether this is the teacher or a businessman or people who were close to Gülen at the time, or academics. There's quite a lot of content on loss. Learning, I think, is kind of intertwined with each individual experience. But when it comes to the very last section of that chapter on learning, it seems like, I don't want to say there isn't an awful lot, but other than what Kelesh is saying, there isn't, which is a lot of critique. It doesn't seem like there is a lot of learning in the loss that can be easily identified. I guess there's a lot for critique. What's your kind of general opinion on that?
First of all, I guess one of the things to say is obviously partly in terms of the interview material that reflects a period now of some years ago, but also a period that was not too far beyond the events of 2016. And given what I refer to in the book as trauma experienced by so many people in different ways, some people more directly and others more indirectly, I think that it's probably if you like, unrealistic to expect like a rapid learning process to take place, because people have to live with and in a sense take it into themselves and work out trauma, take it seriously before it's possible then to, if you like, in some ways move on from it by asking those questions about what can be learned from this. So, and I think actually it's not so much in this book, but in, I think, the European book, there is drawing attention to how far trauma impacts on people, and not to draw parallels because it's not the same. But I know that some Hizmet people recommended that Hizmet people should talk with other people who've experienced significant traumas. And I think that's partly in order to actually, recognize what kind of a process is involved in being traumatized. That it has its own effect that lasts for quite a while before it's possible to emerge from it. So I guess, in overall response to your question, that's what I'd say about it. So I wasn't, if you like, personally greatly surprised that probably the trauma, if you like, outbalanced the learning in the chapter, because, as I say, it reflected also now some three and a half years ago, some of the interviews 4 years ago. So I think there was still a good deal of rawness about the trauma.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just link that trauma to the beginning. I mean, where Kailash raised a lot of queries about why some of the work that he had been done had kind of been, say, dismissed, but some things had been leaked, and there was a whole issue. And then he says, this was done for X reason, and this was done for Y reason. I was wondering if that was at all jumping to conclusions and assuming the intentions or perhaps reasons behind things. I mean, I don't know, it could be that people were trying to protect their own backs. It could have been that there was a sincere effort to keep unity within the movement. And these are all kind of arguments that are kind of fed into the chapter. Or perhaps there is just an issue with communicating some of the grievances and feedback to different individuals. Perhaps it's an intergenerational thing. Perhaps it's a different style of Hizmet and different culture in country and context. I mean, there's, I think, again, Kailash mentions that those in the US weren't as aware of critiques that the Hizmet movement was facing. And once they were made aware of it, they didn't really care so much, and it didn't particularly bother them. So I mean, I was just wondering if it was a lot of assumptions that perhaps were merged into one there. I was wondering if anyone other than Kailash had raised any critiques in this regard at all.
Yes, but not in as direct or clear or sharp a way. So I think this is partly a matter of different styles of expression, and of course, I mean, Özcan is by training a legal mind and has that kind of forensic approach that comes from that, whereas others who might have criticisms and concerns, and that was certainly the case among a number of the European interviewees. And I know, for example, also in Australia, there were statements made as well from, I think, originally from Queensland in Australia, but also from other states in Australia, in relation to how far or certainly particular spokes bodies for the movement in the USA might have responded. So it's not only him, no. But I think, I mean, I made quite a lot of use in the chapter of what he had to say in critique because of its clarity of critique. Now, that's not necessarily, I'm not saying I'm not in a position to fully evaluate what's going on there. I'm not an insider, and it's not my role to do that. What I was trying to do, I think, by bringing that sharply critiquing voice into very much focus in that chapter, was partly in relation to those who critique the movement by saying, well, there is no debate. Now, of course, I know that part of what Özcan is saying is that debate can take place, but it's dampened down, or it's not taken seriously, or it's not enough public. But I think I was trying to make clear that there can be quite sharply differential voices and positions and different approaches, rather than this picture that sometimes is given from those who study the movement outside, that it's that doesn't happen, that doesn't take place. So I think that was why.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of go back to the section on loss.
Yeah.
Like I said, there seems to be a lot of ways individual people kind of internalize lessons that they may be taking. So whether
Yes,
that's
that's right. Yes, yeah,
whether
yeah.
that's
So I think what I was trying to do there was, in effect, I guess, give a range of what one might call personal testimonies,
Mhm.
partly in order to make clear, also to people who might only have a very general knowledge or very little knowledge at all, that just because, for example, you don't end up in prison in Turkey doesn't mean you haven't been severely traumatized. That people who one day were going to work normally in their day-to-day jobs and environment and doing their thing, the next day suddenly found themselves absolute persona non grata, and like the world kind of collapsed, or the world as it was known collapsed under their feet. And I think, that's not sufficiently appreciated or understood in terms of what one might call general knowledge of how what occurred. I mean, of course, there were already some things happening before 2016 in regard to individuals, but certainly what occurred subsequently was, yeah, very dramatic in its effects for many, many individuals and families. In that sense, for many ordinary people as well. So I was trying to give a portrayal that, of course, in the book, I have interviewed a number of asylum seekers whose identities I don't give. I mean, they were not like what you might call leading public figures in the movement. They were generally just ordinary people. um, and I wanted to, yeah, convey through their stories, that impact in the first place. But then what you do see in those stories is also partly a questioning. I think it's there not in a sharp or even necessarily clearly articulated form as occurs from Kelesh Arva, but there is this, almost wistful reflectiveness on what might have been, and or were there people involved in what happened in 2016 at the level of the coup attempt, and those kind of questionings. Now, they're not what you might call systematic learnings, but some of that is a reflectiveness on also what perhaps had happened in terms of the kind of social position and alignments of movement related things in Turkey, having in that sense achieved relatively privileged positions, and then the collapse of that, leading to questions about, well, what did that mean? And then as people become asylum seekers, of course, that's in a very radical form, leads to the kind of dislocation of time and place, and everything that you've held as normal for yourself, in a way that migration, for economic reasons, can also bring about, but not so sharply, I think, as when what you call forced migration, through the kind of circumstances that occur that make those things in a very dramatic way. But they don't necessarily lead to a set of conclusions very rapidly, but they lead to a lot of questions. And I think in the interviews with the asylum seekers, I was trying to bring out there this questioning sense, and also what does that mean now, in the future, for those who came as asylum seekers in the wider European context. How does one rebuild on the other side of something like that. Now, those things were explored in more what one might call programmatic sense in the other book on Hizmet in European context. So again, there's a sort of a complementarity and a different emphases in the two books. So this book, and as indicated by the heading of the section, and well, the whole title, Learning from Loss, and you'll notice that actually it has a question mark at the end of the title. Not learning from loss statement, learning from loss question mark, but trauma doesn't have a question mark. So that in this chapter, that's the kind of balance I was seeking to communicate and bring about. Whereas in the Hizmet in Europe, European Transitions book, I then tried to show a little bit more about some of the kind of, if you like, organizational consequences in the European setting that then flow from some of that in a more programmatic sense. What does this mean about how we now do X, Y, and Z? In this one, it was trying to communicate that sense very strongly, and also in relation to Gülen himself and this kind of phrase, wounded exile, and so on, because that certainly was something just at a kind of human level of interviewing a person that struck me quite significantly. So he had ways of articulating that, ways of dealing with it, ways of relating it to things that had happened also in his own past. But I think, to me, it was very clear that this was also in a way of a different order, in particular because I think perhaps carrying this sense of responsibility for what happened to others. In that sense, that because of their association in one way or another, even by only reading a book or whatever, and in that sense, the breadth of the trauma affecting so many people.
I mean, that was something that I kind of wanted to pick up. I mean, the term wounded exile and whilst interviewing him, I mean, there are kind of quotes, I think, from other interviewees as well, who then talk about how Gülen links this and how his kind of sermons have changed to a more kind of, I mean, they all focus on forgiveness and in the 2016 context. And I think there's somewhere where Gülen says that, he forgives them, or if he was to meet those who were persecuting on his own side, he would act as if he didn't remember and say, oh, well, that didn't even happen, to that extent of forgiveness. But then when talking about all the individual lives of those who were impacted, he said that then that's to God. I mean, in just when you were kind of interviewing him personally, I was wondering, was there anything in particular that struck you, perhaps about his kind of demeanor whilst talking about the topic, or when the topic of kind of persecution of people, both in Turkey and internationally? I mean, kidnappings, I don't know if they had occurred at the time when you were doing your
yes, there had been in some countries.
But takeovers of schools and things as well.
Well, that definitely was present, and I think commented on, and clearly, in that sense, initiatives that people had made and taken and given a lot of their lives for were being taken apart, and that, I think, as I recall it, in terms of how you about that. That was clearly, very impacted on him. I mean, there is this tension, of course, between a person's personal stance in relation to a potential capacity for forgiveness and their recognition of, for example, the need for justice as distinct from revenge. And I think what I see in, and I tried to reflect in how I reported what he had to say on these things, and particularly the selection of quotations from him, was this kind of delicate balance, because I think there was a recognition there that the impact of such a trauma could lead people to a very reactive response. He himself, I think, was trying to, take this strong emphasis on forgiveness, but that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a reckoning for what's occurred in terms of injustice. Now, the reckoning he largely, I think, puts in his understanding in the hands of God rather than in the hands of humankind, although, of course, there are passages that in the chapter where he talks about what happens in history to those who become overreaching and overbearing in terms of misuse of power. So that is there, but at a more, in a way, a more general level, let's say. It's expressed in that way, I think. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, and then the forgiveness aside, there's also this, I mean, Hijra has always been in the discourse of the Hizmet movement.
Yeah, yeah. Mm.
But now it's kind of in the post-2016 era, it's kind of taken a twist. And actually individual members of the movement are using it. And I think there's someone from Spain in the art, in the, who says that, he prefers this term because it's I guess more innocent than whatever. I mean, innocent in what sense that than a migrant or an asylum seeker. Gülen doesn't have the exact same position. I mean, he's kind of wary. Could you kind of open up that?
I did ask him deliberately and specifically about this because of it having been articulated, particularly in a number of the European interviews, and at the time, I mean, many of those, well, some took place before my interview with him and some after. So, but it was clearly something that was coming through as a means of trying to understand, to put a framework, let's say, and in that sense, maybe a religious framework on what had occurred, a framework of interpretation. Now, I mean, he, in his answer, have to look in the chapter itself to get it exactly, but I mean, fundamentally what he was saying was, well, Hijra as such was a very specific historical thing in a particular context, etc. But there are aspects that have echoes, if you like, in terms of how people can understand the experience of setback, if you like. Now, of course, for others, and this is where it comes into kind of critique, as you say, part of Kellish's critique is what he calls post-fact causality, which is, I guess, the tendency among people who are religious for good reasons, because if religious people believe that ultimately kind of all things are in the hands of the divine, then you can kind of try and interpret things backwards in order to explain why something has happened. And of course, the other aspect to that is that there are parts of what Gülen says that at least poses the question, well, have such things come about because we were not sufficiently faithful, ambitious, bold, etc. And of course, those kind of questionings, and again, not to draw a direct parallel, but for example, I know within the Jewish scene post the Holocaust, there were many Orthodox Jews who interpreted the Holocaust almost in the sense of, well, where had we not gone, where had we gone wrong, rather than how is it that this evil that was perpetrated upon us came about. And so there is that kind of a problematic wrapped up in all of this, I guess. So how does one take seriously the impact of what happens in space and time, if you like, and yet set it within some kind of eternal horizon? Because I think for Gülen, that's what he's trying to do. Now that again is different than what I work out and look at more in the complementary book, where the question is then more, how does the movement or parts of it, organizational expressions of it, make sense of things, and what does it then do? But for Gülen himself, I think it's these, very clearly, and also I think I quote from one of his talks where he gives very clearly the sense of what's happened, but not only that, but uses it as a critique also on, quotes unquote, the Muslim world, which is a phrase that he critiques in any case. People who've lost so much, where has the help come from? Has it come from the Muslim world, or has it come from people who are not Muslims, from Christians, or even from non-believers who are willing to support? And that in itself is a kind of a quite a potentially pregnant learning point, I think, that does then get taken up, I think, in other testimonies in different ways. Not, I think, because Gülen said that kind of thing, but because other people then start to think, okay, well, for example, there's some reflection on this traumatization thing, that, okay, those of us who grew up in a Turkish environment with all that meant in terms of assumptions, could we really believe what might have happened to the Armenian people? Well, now maybe we can believe it, and maybe we can even have some contact that does something positive out of all of this, in a way that wouldn't have been possible in a way had we not gone through this experience. But of course, that's not a justification for going through the experience. And this is the difficulty, I think, in talking about these things, how to express that kind of learning in a way that doesn't sound like, oh, well, we had to go through this because what's being gone through is clearly traumatic and unjust. So yeah, so I was conscious of those kind of, I think, dynamics in that chapter, but I wanted to have the chapter, and again, the particular place in the book, before coming to the last chapter, which sort of talks about, well, okay, there's a if you like, an inheritance from Gülen's teaching and practice. What might that be? How might that be taken up? How might that be taken forward? But it's not like, I made quite a lot in the book about evolution, if you like, and there is an evolution, but I think this as a trauma needs to be taken seriously as a trauma along that evolutionary path. It's not all then the same evolutionary path. There is a trauma that's happened. And that's what I wanted to try to get across, I guess, particularly to people, like I say, readers who might not have any inside knowledge of that, perhaps.
I mean, whilst reading the chapter, I think the only section of where Gülen was quoted that I thought perhaps there's some sort of kind of comfort that those who use the kind of hijra for their own kind of forced migration is where he says, he was talking about perhaps lessons that could be learned, and then he talks about, well, the only thing that I think is sad about is how he couldn't explain himself, or the Hizmet movement couldn't. I mean, how did we have so many enemies in Turkey? Like, could we not, articulate ourselves or kind of share our message with our own people?
Yes.
That's kind of the only place where there's sort of some, I don't want to say hard feelings, but where he clearly expresses some other than the persecution of the people themselves within that context. But yeah, no, I mean, yes, I've just now got that passage in front of me where I've looked at it. So yes, and there is this then that he speaks about destiny's direction for the people of Hizmet, that they failed to do this voluntarily. In a sense, God pushed them involuntarily into the world, and these kind of reflections. Yeah.
But I think that does need, and of course this is difficult, I think, and it's also difficult for example, for a general readership of the book, where people may not have a religious perspective on life. This can seem also very strange, or a way of avoiding something. But again, this is what I guess throughout the book I'm trying to say about Gülen himself, that you can interpret him biographically according to historical currents, you can interpret sociologically, etc. But unless you interpret religiously, you're missing an enormous, you're looking through one eye and not through two glasses of the spectacles, because this sense that I got at top of page 172, ultimately from Gülen's perspective, because he primarily looks at temporal things within an overall theological vision of the passing of all earthly powers, that despite the suffering he's very much aware of that came out of July 2016, informed by the conviction of faith, he says, and then I quote, "On the other hand, this persecution, this oppression, I don't think it will last for very long." When you look at the example of Hitler, of Saddam, of Gaddafi, or others like themselves who persecuted people, they end up with terrible ends. So there's this balance. Now, of course, you could say, well, is that a misreading, or is that a collapse of time? Because he goes on to say, I think their end is near. Right now, we can see signs of their end. They're recognizing their persecution. Culturally, they're going down. Well, okay, it's still some years on. What does that mean? But I think, again, I was trying to here, I think, again, last week we talked about Islamic heroism, and here I was trying to say, okay, well, this is clearly not, I mean, there is a heroism in a proper sense, actually, about people who survived enormous personal upheaval, trauma, threats, dismissal, loss of jobs, family displacement, traveling across seas by boat, and all of that. That is, in a way, real heroism, but it's not expressed in the sense of how I was talking about that earlier in the book, and that what can come out of that in terms of learning in a different way than always being victorious, because here is a phase where clearly, if you like, Hizmet is not victorious. Mm-hmm. But then, yes, this self-criticism, and again in the book, the section where I talked about self-criticism, you'll see again it's entitled Self-Criticism and Its Limits. So I was trying to acknowledge, okay, things come out as questions that don't only, because it would be, in one sense, and I think this is what Kellish is trying to say, don't just give a set of explanations according to the temporal and the eternal. Mm-hmm. Not that that, if you're a believer, isn't important, but that can become an excuse for not taking ethical responsibility in relation to choices that have been made that may or may not have been helpful. So don't use it as a post-fact justification, and that's what I think what all of that is about.
It made sense to me that he was raising the issue as a kind of, I mean, purposely or not, it covers up the opportunity for learning, I assume.
That it can, a certain kind of, one can use the word pious in two ways. One can use it very accurately, descriptively for people who are, if you like, people of prayer and spirituality. One can also use it in a way that certainly it's sometimes used in kind of Western European context against a certain kind of form of Christianity that was called pietism, which is about avoiding the historical, avoiding the actual by kind of fleeing into another otherworldly kind of way of understanding it. So, yeah, how to hold together, I guess, the ultimately theological conviction and horizons that I think Gülen wishes to bring to bear in all of this, with the more kind of almost pragmatic would be the wrong word, because it shouldn't be entirely pragmatic, but the choices, the concrete choices that need to be reflected on from the past and need to be examined and considered for the future. And that it's not impious to ask, in the wrong sense, to ask sharp questions. Mm-hmm. It's possible to do that while holding to also a kind of an ultimate theological vision as well. So, but yes, you do have this sense then that others, and again, it's one of them is an anonymous interviewee. So, but for example, about change and so on, there are lots of signs of life inside the community. it's for sure that lots of people are confused, and Fethullah Gülen is not giving concrete directions. It's like he's waiting for something. Now, that again was a little bit, that was 2-3 years back, but I think, you know, that was an interesting observation from a particular perspective.
I mean, the question which comes to what kind of direction were people, or are people at all, waiting to hear or see? Was that at all mentioned? Because it seems like quite a, I mean, I don't know if they're looking for a kind of spiritual direction, or if they're looking for a political direction, or a do this kind of direction. It's a question mark.
Yeah.
I mean, what did you kind of, what sense did you get that people were in need of by direction?
I mean, I think part of it does relate to an understanding of what has occurred, but on a number of levels, including these, if you like, missing levels, in the way that on the one hand, Gülen articulates the trauma strongly, and on the other hand, the theological vision, but the in-between, and then the in-between is articulated differently by different groups and bodies and individuals within Hizmet, perhaps according to their standing, their history. So it's this sense of, in a way, almost how to, in an explicit way, within the wider environment of the movement, to, it's not necessarily expecting Gülen to himself give a specific word, I think. But the question is, I guess, what I had the sense of was a number of interviewees in different ways, not being sure what his perspective might be on pursuing some of these questions. Yeah, that's where I think. So not having a clear indication, in a way, of is that to be pursued or is that not to be pursued, I think is perhaps where that lies. I'm not sure.
Interesting. I mean, I did realize that when a lot of the asylum speakers were kind of also talking, I mean, they had a large focus, I think, one on pulling their lives together kind of material, in a material fashion, and also the kind of legal structure of you know, gaining residency in wherever they were. And also on the flip side of that, there was the kind of constant, well, I don't want to say constant, but a frequent reference to psychologically, we're not okay, we need help. That was something that kind of came up, and it seemed like every conversation with an asylum seeker as well. I mean, was that something that you felt was there? I mean, I can remember.
Very, very, very much so, which is why, you know, why I use in this chapter a lot, and why quite often in other contexts when I've talked about kind of post 216 things, I constantly use this word trauma, because I think it's the significance and depth of that. It's understanding what trauma means. It's not just change. Now, you could say, you know, let's say that for those who are Hizmet migrants into Europe in an earlier period, they experienced substantial change and sometimes substantial challenge to inherited frameworks because of difference in culture, cultural environments. But trauma is something different. It's not just an added set of changes. It's something at a more fundamental human, where I am, who I am, what I am, what this is level, from which it's very difficult to I mean, it's kind of almost all-encompassing in a certain way, until you can find means of rebuilding. And some forms of rebuilding, of course, almost go about trying to, or not necessarily consciously, but mask this trauma rather than confront or live it through and try and work with it. And there's an inevitability in that, because you have to pull your life together, you have to get on with things, you have to earn. Once you're at least out of an asylum seeker or refugee environment where you can't earn, you have to make a living, and your family has to survive, and all of these things come crowding in. But the question is, do they then crowd in to the extent that the trauma is not worked through, or is there the possibility still to work through that? And again, I think in the other chapter, rather more, there's an exploration of that and of the potential consequences and needs arising from that, and potential learnings from other groups, religious and or ethnic, that have had experiences of trauma, because fundamentally it's a human thing. I mean, obviously the shape that it takes and the questions that it arises for one religiously or culturally are particular, but the trauma itself is just human.
We're kind of in the last 9 minutes, but just to kind of, not quick, but interesting question. I mean, there was a lot of talk. I think both Özcan and Kirimbalcı referred to there being an old side and a new side era.
Yes.
And that one shouldn't shy from critique in that sense, that even the new side would have conversations with old side and then write on how he's developed his kind of thought process and as an individual. Is there a clear or distinctive, do you think, either new or old Hizmet? I mean, I think in comparison to Said Nursi and his kind of movement, that was really focused on the one scholar and his texts being dispersed throughout Turkey. But the Hizmet movement's more of the text inspiring individuals, and then those individuals making change, whether they're a teacher, a lawyer, or whatever profession that they then go on to. So maybe, I mean, old Said, new Said, old Gülen, new Gülen isn't the best sort of comparison. But is there a sort of old Hizmet, new Hizmet on the horizon? Are there clear distinctions? I mean, you've been studying the movement for a very long time. Can you see, change in that at all?
I mean, I don't think there's an old Gülen and a new Gülen in that personalized sense. With regard to the movement, I think it's probably still too early to say that. I think there are, in some manifestations of the movement, there are clear things occurring. Well, I think, you see, again, in the other book, I do argue that many of the changes that one might now identify were already in process, but that what's happened is that 2016 and its aftermath and implications have accelerated and intensified
with a bit of
trends that might already have been there to some extent. And that's what I think has been happening. Mm-hmm. So that some of the kind of questions, we've touched in other weeks on, for example, debates around gender, for example. It wasn't that there weren't, mm-hmm. but I think, partly as a byproduct. And certainly questions about the relationship of in that sense, what I, under the broad heading called religion, state and society, I think there's quite a lot of evidence of that. Particularly, it struck me quite strongly in the German interviews in particular, but not only there, of a much more explicit, and also the question about relationships, for example, with other Muslims. So all these things were not unknown as previous debates, but it is this, intensification and speeding up, perhaps, of things that would have been evolutionary as a consequence both of migratory change and globalization of the movement. But because of the original heartland, in a sense, being cut away so abruptly, that has this intensification effect.
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember reading a report. I think it was 2014, maybe. I think it was a Hizmet kind of inspired institute in Turkey that was kind of writing about transparency issues, etc., that post-coup came to light in a fashion where, you know, European states were also asking the Hizmet movement members in those countries of questions about their movement, and they had to perhaps interrogate things amongst themselves and be able to. I think Holland is a case where the state kind of really questioned those there.
No, very much. And again, certainly in the other book, you can say, I mean, there was almost a constant state of questioning in Holland, one commission after the other, almost, to the extent that I doubt if it's questionable whether any other movement of similar kind in the Netherlands had so much, if you like, external questioning brought to bear. And that was, you know, before 2016, not after. But yeah, how far that then, the kind of consequences of that, or why those questions were being asked, were taken on board. I think actually in the Netherlands, they were taken on board quite strongly, as far as I can tell, from a relatively early period. And it wasn't necessarily the impact of 2016 and beyond that has really made those particular things.
Mm-hmm. In sort of global sense, do you think there are any other countries where that has happened? I mean, do you think the UK is an example of that with the Voices platform?
Yeah, but again, Voices, at least the original thinking around that, goes back, I've forgotten exactly when, but I think 2013 or 14. And so I think it's, if I'm remembering correctly, it took a while for it to take shape and be articulated and then come into a public form. But in a sense, the kind of things that lay behind why Voices might be developed were already, and they were debates that were going on. I mean, I'm kind of aware of those debates going on at an earlier time. So obviously they take different form, and in some sense sharper form, because of what's subsequently occurred. But yeah.
I mean, I just thought, I mean, Holland and the UK are both countries which have a kind of strong dialogue activity process. I think that's also mentioned in the chapter that, you know, I think it's maybe Özcan comments on, through dialogue encounters, you know, there's that sense of critique that comes, and then obviously you reflect that back into your own movement. And then, I mean, you know, someone might just ask when you're networking, oh, well, how is your organization funded? And then you realize that you don't have an articulate answer or way of answering that. So then you go back and you're kind of forced to look at that and articulate yourself, and how's that transparency, for example? So.
I think yes, and there are different European cultural things around that, and I mean the Netherlands. There's some interesting parts in the interviews from the Netherlands where people are kind of saying, well, we've finally figured it out that in the Netherlands, when people are being robust in what they're asking you, it doesn't mean that they're against you. It means that's actually that they mean they're kind of accepting you, but they want to know, they want to understand. And it's a sign of respect, not of disrespect. Whereas in other cultural contexts, the sharp asking of questions can be perceived as disrespectful. And the Netherlands, I think, is a very robust society, more robust than the UK, I think, at the kind of normal citizenry level. Germany can also be quite clear and sharp in its public debates, but the Netherlands, I think, is a particular example. Has a lot of echoes, of course, for the UK, because there are quite a number of societal similarities, I think, between the Netherlands and the UK, and a lot of historical contacts that are important for understanding the both. But that then goes to another set of questions, which again, I guess get touched on a little bit in the last chapter, which we'll be coming to next week of this book, but certainly in the other book. Slightly different trajectories in different European countries. What mechanisms does the dialogue platform in Brussels, in the sense, still have a significant role? What is that? What do these differences mean? Is it possible to learn from each other, challenge each other? How does that? Is there like sometimes people ask the question: is there a European Islam, or is there a European Hizmet, or only Hizmet in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Spain, etc.? Yeah.
Okay, we'll leave end on for next week, and I just got answering them in my own mind, but I'll read the chapter. I will come back to you with my question.
Do tell me your answer, whatever I wrote.
Okay, I will. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.